Introducing 100 Days of Code with Treehouse. What is 100 Days of Code? It's a long-standing coding challenge created by Alex Callaway, and it's simple. Commit to learning every day for 100 days. The amount that you learn in that short time frame will change your life. Whether you want to level up your skills or jumpstart a new career, commit to the challenge. You'll be shocked by how much you learn and accomplish. You'll have the full support of the Treehouse community of students working with you. We'll be sending you motivational emails, clips from our 100 Days of Code podcast, featuring advice, tips and tricks from developers, and so much more. There's never been a better time to commit to your learning. Join us.
Cool. All right. Well, hello again, everyone. Good to see you. I'm Gil, live streaming from South Florida as always, and hope you are all doing awesome and well out there. I am a software development instructor at Treehouse. That's teamtreehouse.com, where I teach full stack JavaScript and front-end web development. You can also check out all previous live streams in our YouTube playlist. If you've been watching some of those, again, thank you and welcome back. So yeah, in last week's live stream, we started talking about the DOM, or Document Object Model, right? What makes up the DOM? What does it really look like? And I also covered basic tasks JavaScript can do with the DOM, along with reading and changing elements on the page. So today we're going to do a little bit more of that, right? We'll continue with more JavaScript and the DOM, and creating interactivity with JavaScript and the DOM, it can really be broken down into three actions: selecting elements on the page, manipulating elements, and listening for user actions. So now we'll spend some time talking about two of those actions, selecting and manipulating, right? So getting a handle of the DOM and making changes to it with JavaScript. So for example, you get a reference to one or multiple elements in the document, then you do something to them or with them. And then we'll get into DOM traversal, so how to get around in or traverse the DOM, as it's called. It's similar to selection, and it's really useful when you already have a reference to one element or node, and then you can get a hold of other elements nearby it, so it's pretty handy in that way. This is a multi-part series, so part 2 of 3. In an upcoming live stream, we'll get into listening for user actions, responding to user events, and even creating elements dynamically, right, and inserting them into the page. So yeah, this is part 2 of 3. So a lot of good stuff to come after this in regards to the DOM. We also have a Treehouse moderator in the chat room. So if you have questions about anything in this presentation, ask away, and those questions will be sent my way. So before we get going, let's do a quick review of some of what I covered last week about the DOM. And if you didn't watch it, here we go. We're going to cover it in a nutshell here. So I talked about how the DOM is an object-oriented representation of a web page, right? It's really an API that offers a collection of methods and properties that are made available to JavaScript in the browser, so you can manipulate the page. And that the DOM is represented as a tree-like structure of HTML tags that stem out from one root element or node. Looks like this. So the browser also has something called the window object. And it's a global object that has all the properties and methods pertaining to the current browser window, what you're seeing in the tab. And that window object is also what contains a DOM document, right? And that's the entry point into the web page's content, right? That's what you start working with. So the other thing we learned was that JavaScript and the DOM are two different things, right? The two different entities. JavaScript is the core syntax and the core programming language, and the DOM itself is an API. All right, so last week I talked a little bit about how there's a two-step sequence, right, when controlling an element in the DOM with JavaScript. First, you find it or select it in the document. Then you do something with it, right? You can either read it, you can either read or manipulate it in some way. So we're going to have a look at selection, right? So selection really is a way to identify an element for a browser. So then the browser can reference and make it available for us. So we can do stuff to it with JavaScript. So I am going to start working with this simple pet directory page I created. In fact, if you want to follow along in your browser's JavaScript console, check out the link posted in the chat. I sent that over to the moderator, so you should be getting it soon. Yeah, simple page. It consists of a header holding a graphic of a paw and a headline. And the directory itself is a unordered list containing the pet names, right, as list items. Cool. So the DOM interface offers lots of methods you can use to access elements in the document or on the page. Now, these aren't all of them, but I'll get into some of the most commonly used elements for methods for selection. So first let's have a look at get element by ID. So I'll open the console here, the JavaScript console, and I'll type document.getElement by ID, and this is a method, right? So document, again, represents the current web page, and it's kind of that entry point into the DOM tree or the page's content. And I'm going to pass it the string, a string of the ID I want to return, right? So let's do main content. Notice I don't need to include the hash symbol in front of it because it already knows to look for the ID. So yeah, the browser looks through the entire page, right, for an element with that specified ID. Then it returns the element if it exists. So in this case, it returns the single HTML element with the main content ID. And then you could do things to it, like I showed you last week. So for example, we have a reference to it here, and let's call the style property on it, and let's do style border. Let's give it a 2-pixel border, right, red. And that applies a lovely red border around the main content element, right? And yeah, you can also select elements with the same class name with this method, get elements by class name. So let's have a look at that real quick. So back in the console, I'll do document.getElements by class name, and then I'll pass it a string of the class I'd like to return. Again, I don't have to type .pet, I can just do pet. And so notice, take a step back here. The big difference here between get element by ID and get elements by class name, right? Since IDs are unique, or they should be unique across your entire document, that returns a single element, right? While get elements by class name returns multiple elements. But notice how it's what it returns. It's like an array-like collection, it's an array-like collection, really, holding references of these 5 list items with the class pet. More on that in just a bit. Now, in a similar way, we have the get elements by tag name, and it lets you access elements with the same HTML tag. So let me change this to get elements by tag name, and I'll pass it the li tag, since that's what I want to get. And this returns that same collection, right, holding the pet LIs. And again, I'll get into that a little bit more in a few. Now, really, moving on to one of my favorite selection methods, because they are the most flexible to use, and the ones I tend to use now the most. CSS selectors to grab elements from the DOM, and they can accept IDs, classes, tag names, and more, right? Different types of selectors that you would use in CSS. For example, I'll do document.querySelector and pass it the string header, and that's going to return the header element. Let's do something like query selector header image, right? We're passing it a descendant selector, and then that returns the image because the image is a descendant of the header. And it's super flexible. Again, we can do IDs. So instead of doing get element by ID, we can do document.querySelector pound main content, and so on, right? So if we wanted to return the pet list, we can do document.querySelector.petList, and that's the unordered list with the class pet. So it's really, really flexible. And this was one of the biggest benefits of using a library like jQuery in the past. It was really easy to select pretty much any element in a browser compatible way with jQuery methods. But now you can access elements really in the same way natively with JavaScript using query selector and query selector all. Now, a couple things. Notice that if I run document.query selector pet, if I can type that correctly. So I'm going to do document.querySelector.pet, right? There's multiple list items in the document with the class pet. So here I'm accessing that class with query selector. So if I do that, even though there are multiple elements with that class, it's only going to return the first one it finds, right? That first matching element, in this case, this one here, right? Joey the Australian Shepherd, which, by the way, is my dog. So if you want to get a collection of all the pet li elements on the page, you can do that with query selector all, right? And this is what you'd use to return all elements that match the selector. But notice again, it returns something a little bit different. It returns this thing called a node list. And it looks very similar to that HTML collection we saw earlier. It just works a little bit differently. So let's get into that. What is a node list and what is an HTML collection? So node list and HTML collection are pretty much, they're very much the same thing. They're very, very close. So they're both collections of DOM nodes, and you get them back in the order they appear on the page. Now the difference is that a node list is a whole lot more flexible because it can contain any node type, right? You have element types and text types. So a node list can get all that for you. It returns element nodes and text nodes, for example. And it's often a live collection, meaning that the DOM, any changes in the DOM automatically update the collection for you. So another cool thing is that it's an array-like structure. So you can iterate through it with methods like for each, a for loop even, and some of the more modern array iteration methods. Now HTML collection, it's like an array, but it only holds node elements. And since it's like an array, you can call properties on it like you do with two arrays like length, and you can use bracket notation to get an element via its index, and we'll look at all that next. But yeah, so it's similar to an array. The only thing you can't do is some of the array iteration methods on it, like for each, even though there's ways around that, and I can show you. Yeah, so let's take a closer look at some of these in our project. So first, let's work with a HTML collection, right? So let's do document.get elements by class name, since that's going to return a collection for you. And let's get all the classes, all the elements with the class pet. Again, you can see that it returns the HTML collection, and I can call .length on it, right? Since it's kind of like an array, and that returns 5, since there are indeed 5 elements in the collection. And like I said, you can access a specific element using bracket notation. So let's grab a hold of that collection and let's do square brackets 0, and that's going to return the first element, Joey, again, the first element in the collection. You can even get and set its properties. So once I have that, we can do, let's say, on that 0 index element, let's do style.color red, and so on, right? So it turns the color of the first list item red. Now, notice I'm not able to do stuff to all the elements at once, right? So if I want to manipulate all the elements with the class pet at once, for instance, I can't do that, right? I'll show you. So I can't do like get elements by class name pet, and instead of 0 index, we'll do pet .style.color red. That's going to return an error. Cannot set property of color undefined, right? So you can't call style.color on that HTML collection itself. So yeah, let's take a look at how we can loop through that collection and then do stuff to elements all at once. Right, so like I said, in this case, you would have to use a loop, to iterate through the collection and then do something to it, kind of one by one. So first, what I'll do is I'll assign the collection to a variable. So let's say const pets equals document dot let's do, get elements by class name. Again, we'll target all the classes pet. And we got to iterate through that collection. So I'll log it to the console first. I'll use a good old for loop for this, right? So let me set that up here real quick. So I'm iterating through the length of that pets collection here and log it. So that is represented by this I variable. So console.log I. Keeps wanting to autocorrect that. Okay. In this case, it's not doing that. Why? Because I need to do this, right? So I is actually the index. So let's do pets I. So pets square bracket I. And there we go. So that's going to return all those LIs with the class pet. No, and then you can manipulate these in some way within the loop. So let's do that. So I'll bring back the loop, and then in the code block, instead of logging it to the console, let's turn their color blue, for example. So I can do pets, again, the collection, I, and then style.color blue. And yeah, so all at once, it loops through that collection, and then it turns the colors blue. Again, you do this with CSS, but this is an example of how it all works, right? How you can access everything and manipulate it. Yeah, so one thing to keep in mind when you're doing this is that the HTML collection is not quite an array, right? So that means you can't do certain things to it, like call array iteration methods on it, like for each, for example, unless you convert it to an array first. And I'll show you, really the quickest and easiest way to do that is using the spread operator. So for example, I still have a reference to that pets variable, right? So what's assigned to pets? So I can do ... pets. So here's my, I'm spreading that collection out into this new array. And then now I can call for each on it, right? So I'll do for each. And so we'll say for each pet. Let's do something to it. Let's take a pet, call style.color on it, and make the color, let's do background color so we can really see that. Let's do background yellow. And yep, so that worked. I was able to take that collection, turn it into array, and loop through it and make it yellow. Again, just an example of how you can change elements once you've accessed them via the DOM. Cool. Now we had a look at how to kind of iterate through HTML collection. Now let's have a look at a node list, which works in the same way. So let's again make sure I don't have a reference to pet anymore. Nope, good. So clear that. So I'll again create another variable named pets, and this time do document query selector all. And what do I want to select? Well, the class pet. So once I have that, pets is now pointing to the node list. I can manipulate them. And again, we'll do P for pet. And we'll do a border. Let's do style dot border. Solid 5 pixels. Cornflower blue. Why not? Cornflower blue. And yeah, so that, as you can see, it works in much the same way. We have 5 pixel border around each list item. Good. Yeah, so you saw that there's a lot of methods, right, for selection. This is just a handful that we covered. There's different ways to make the same selections, but how do you know which one to use? What's the right one? Well, it depends, right? A lot of it might be determined by the HTML you're working with, right? If there are any specific IDs on the elements you want to select, you can use get element by ID. Do you want to select all the elements of a tag name specifically, all the elements that share a certain class? But again, in many cases, I really recommend the more modern and flexible query selector all and query selector methods. Let's see. I got a question here. Thank you. So the question is, so I guess that there is no possibility of getting a collection of all items using get elements by ID, so we can use them in the example in the loop. Correct. Yeah, and like I showed you, in that case, get element by ID returns one element, so there's no need to loop through anything, right? You get an immediate reference to the element. In the case where you want to get multiple elements, you use query selector all or the elements by tag name, and then iterate through that collection or node list, as I just showed you. Awesome. All right, moving on to DOM traversal. So DOM traversal it's really similar to selection in that you're getting a reference to an element. And traversal itself is a way to move from one part of the DOM to the other and select an element, really based on its relationship to another element. So oftentimes you might already have a reference to a node, like stored in a variable somewhere, and then you need to get a hold of another element nearby. That's DOM traversal, right? Without doing the whole selection thing again. And you can just, all right, I'm pointing to this node. Now let me find its parent, its child from there. That's like your starting point. So yeah, accessing one, you get access from one node to another in the DOM tree. It's really what it's all about. So the DOM API, the good old DOM API, offers a few useful properties you can use for DOM traversal. I'm only going to cover a few here, but really, as you've learned, the relationship between nodes in the DOM can be described by family-like terms, right? Similar to HTML, right? So we have parents, children, siblings, and it all depends on the relationship, right? The relation to other nodes. So in our page, for example, this is a snapshot of some of the code in our pets directory. So header, right, is the parent of image and h1, those two nodes. Main is the parent node of the UL, which is the parent of the LIs, and these LIs together, they're all siblings, and so on. So let's have a look at these traversal methods in the console here. So let's see. So let's get the unordered list, right? So I'll do document.query selector, my favorite, and I want to grab the UL here. So we know that the UL usually contains LIs, right? So let's see what that typing child nodes, for example, returns. That's one property that we can use to return the child nodes of the element we're selecting, right? So let me run that property on it, and as you can see, it returns a node list of the LIs, right? But notice it also returns the text, right? So anything that's not in an element, any text that's not in an element, it's considered a text node. So it returns text nodes and the element nodes themselves here in this node list. And I can access, and I can loop through this and do things to it like you just saw earlier. But let's do, let's do like child nodes 3, right? So that'll bring back child node at index 3 rather. So use bracket notation here that returns the 0 index. Patches the domestic short hair. Yeah, you can do other things like grab the first element in the list. So document.query selector UL, and let's call first element child. That's going to return the first child. We can also do last child, for example. So yeah, it's very convenient because we know we have the UL, but I want to target an LI in it, a specific one. Well, I don't want to do document.query selector again and then get it that way. I can just traverse to it, right, from the initial reference I have of the UL. Cool, so that's referencing child nodes. To get a reference to an element's parent node, you can use this parent node property. So for example, I'll target the h1 with query selector h1. And once I have a reference to that, I can do parent element, right? And that's going to return the header. The one I tend to use is parent node. They both return the same thing. But yeah, so parent element and .parent node is going to get and return the parent of the h1, which, as you can see, it's the header. So yeah, so knowing this, you can do other things, right? You can get the grandparent, if you will. So, document.querySelector parent node dot parent node is going to return the body, and that's because that is then the parent of the header, right? And you can access sibling nodes in a similar way. Real quick, I'll show you the previous element sibling and property and the next element sibling. So for example, let's bring back this H1 selector here, and let's call previous sibling on it, previous element sibling, and that's going to return the image, right? Because the image element is a sibling of the H1, and it appears before the H1. And you can do next element sibling as well, and that's to grab the next, whatever sibling follows it. In this case, there aren't any, so it should return null. Yeah. Any other questions before we wrap up here? Time went by pretty quickly. It's fun with DOM selection and traversal for you. All right, great. So yeah, that's really all I have for you today. Again, this is a multi-part series, so you learned about the powers of the DOM in last week's live stream and then this week's live stream. So we'll get more into listening for user actions, responding to user events, and really making this pet directory a whole lot more interactive in the next live stream. So again, you can learn a lot more of this stuff. Front-end web development, full-stack JavaScript development, Python, PHP, UX design, so much more over at teamtreehouse.com. Always be sure to check out that free trial we have for you there. And I'm also GilH on Twitter if you want to follow me there. And you can always check out this joining.teamtreehouse.com/treehouselive to check out any upcoming live streams. So you can add them to your calendar or sign up to get notified, and that way you will not miss any of our good live streams. So again, thanks so much for tuning in. As always, stay safe out there, be well, and happy coding. Thanks so much.